Hi, everybody. Welcome to our lighting talk. My name is Chris Roper. Just works out. Aha. So we're going to be talking about media capture, and this is Amanda who will introduce herself in a moment. We're going to be talking about media capture and a report and analysis we did in 3 countries, Kenya, Zambia, and South Africa. And in fact, one of the questions earlier about what is the kind of life cycle of student visits and training and other kinds of student training in China, what happens when they come back? That question we're actually going to be addressing in another talk by one of our colleagues at 2:30, who will be looking at the kind of life cycle of that economy, essentially, and what happens and why they do it. So I'm the Deputy CEO for Code for Africa, which is a Pan-African organization. We work in about 21 African countries, I think, 21 or 23, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Strydom. I'm a senior program manager at Code for Africa, and I manage a team called Civic Signal. We are a machine learning and media ecosystems building department at Code for Africa.
So Code for Africa, as I said, is in 21 countries, and we do quite a few things. We have quite a few projects on the go, but I guess one of the kind of central and most trenchant examples of what we do is that we have a big investigative lab which monitors misinformation, foreign government, and other kinds of influence operations in 21 African countries. We also have a fact-checking organization called PRC, which does the kind of whack-a-troll misinformation checking, taking down fake news and so on. I think we're Meta's 4th biggest partner in the world for fact-checking. The investigative lab does the more in-depth kind of follow-the-money kind of like why is this misinformation appearing and who is it benefiting. And then Amanda's program is called Civic Signal, as she told you, which is more the media monitoring and research side of what we do. So we've chosen to focus on media here because it's kind of the enabler of all the other types of influence that are being monitored in the China Index. So I was quite amused to see that South Africa is 5th on the list of most influenced countries by China, and we're 9th on the list in the media category, which I felt was underselling us. In my experience, we should be much higher up, and we're going to go through a bit of a case study of that in a moment. So let me begin by handing over to Amanda, who'll tell you a little bit about so just to explain the project. We interviewed, we had roundtables with media practitioners, NGOs involved in the kind of the regulatory side of media and so on in the 3 countries, and asked them several questions about where they saw specifically Chinese influence playing out in the media. And these are the categories we're going to go through now are the kind of different pillars of where they saw the most influence and the most issues playing out.
Thanks, Chris. So there were 2, as Chris mentioned, there were 2 sort of umbrellas that we discovered within media influence. The one was way more of an editorial influence, which included things like paid punditry. So that was where African academics and independent journalists are sent to, are incentivized or paid to write pro-China in Africa articles that then get published into Chinese state media. From there, these articles then appear on news feeds that a number of news organizations in both, in South Africa, in Kenya, and in Zambia subscribe to. And just as a note, like that is these aren't insignificant subscriptions in both these countries, in all 3 of the countries. So 3 of the biggest news organizations there subscribe to Xinhua News Agency, for instance. These articles then appear in these feeds and are republished within the media titles. From there, this then creates a sort of washing cycle of stories It's appeared in Chinese media. It then appears within the in-country local media. However, this sort of machine laundry system will be explained a lot more in detail by my colleague Justin Arenstein, whose talk is at 2:30 that Chris mentioned. The next kind of category then is native content. So this is content that's produced by Chinese state media and then is made to appear as if local journalists or African journalists had created these stories to be published there. From there, that then gets republished again within African media to make it look like it's sort of media from China being published in sort of stories about Africa that was published there. Interestingly, the propaganda officials referred to this as placing their content as borrowing the boats to reach the sea. Chris will be covering a little bit more about that in the next few minutes in a case study that we'll be discussing.
Right, there we go. So Amanda's spoken a bit about the kind of editorial way in which China exerts influence in different ways on media in the 3 African countries we were looking at, although we have found that these lessons apply to almost all the countries that we work in. One of the other methods of gaining influence points within African media is, as was spoken about earlier, the issues of trainings and of junkets. So China's got a mass training program for African journalists. I think the latest figures I had were that there are 1,000 African reporters attend courses in China every year, which is quite a big number. A little bit later, when I talk about the case study, I'll be talking about a particular person whose name you'll see highlighted in red on the slide, called Buyela Matawani. And we'll be looking at how this person had been sent for a press junket in China, comes back and then becomes part of this laundering cycle of Chinese narratives. But I'll go into that in a bit more detail later. The other way that they exert influence is by partnering with media organizations. So there's quite a long list of media organizations they've partnered with, and they've partnered with editors' guilds in different countries and so on. Another way is by actual ownership of media infrastructure, and there are, again, many examples of that. Huawei, for example, has built about 70% of the 4G infrastructure in Africa. StarTimes, for example, owns the broadcast backbone for several countries, including Kenya, and I think it serves about 13 million subscribers, and it's got its presence in half of the 54 countries in Africa, I think. And the other way is by equity stakes in African media, and I'm going to be looking at a direct example of that. So I'm looking at an example from South Africa, a group called the Independent Media Group, which is, I think, probably the 3rd or 4th biggest media group in South Africa. In 2013, it was acquired by a man called Iqbal Survey, who you'll see in the cartoon, who's not very well liked in South African media circles. It was acquired by him using 4.3 billion rand of public investment corporation money, so pension fund money, state pension fund money, and also part financed by the China International Television Corporation and the China Africa Development Fund. So they've had a 20% stake, direct stake in this media company since 2013. And so I'm using this as an example of how various kinds of mechanisms are implemented in African media organizations. But this is kind of like the purest example that we have. So it begins by ownership of the company, and that with that ownership comes a certain degree of ability to exert influence. In the case of independent media, it's the suspicion is that he has been unable to service his loans from our state public investment fund, and the suspicion is that the Chinese groups, the 20% owners, do not ask him to service their loans, and that's their way of exerting pressure. So the laundry cycle that Amanda alluded to was, articles are aggregated on Independence Online, which is the kind of parent or overarching digital presence for all these independent media newspapers, and they have loads of newspapers in all over South Africa. So articles are aggregated there from Xinhua, for example. Then one of the IRL journalists will write a piece about that, and in that opinion piece, which is just basically quoting verbatim the Xinhua article itself, is then relaundered back into Chinese media as a kind of original look. Out of Africa comes this pro-Chinese content as original and organic content. Now, this is something you're probably quite familiar with, but what is quite startling is the reach that this one media group enables. So we're using Amanda's Civic Signal digital monitoring platform, media monitoring platform, sorry. We monitored, we had a look at coverage of China in South Africa from January 2021 to May 2022. And you'll see that 40% of the coverage comes from this one media house. We looked at 144 different media organizations in South Africa, looked at the coverage. Almost half the coverage comes from just Independence Online, which is a massive kind of a reach. Is another way of looking at it is like, what are the top 5 media organizations in South Africa who cover China? Here, it's even more of a stark disparity. 40% of all the coverage of China is just this one media organization. The next highest is the African News Agency, owned by Independent Online, so in fact the same media organization. Then the next highest is like 3%. So it's an amazing kind of example of the impact of this kind of media ownership. Let me take you through just a quick look at how this process works. So on IRL, they put up a piece that is taken from Xinhua, which I'm suddenly realize I'm sure I'm not pronouncing correctly, but they take a piece from Xinhua, put it up on IRL on March 25th. On March 26th, there's an opinion piece by Buyelwa Matawani, who is the person who, in a previous slide, I showed you as a recipient of a state-sponsored visit to China, who now comes back. And I won't give you all the details because my colleague Justin's going to go through a much more interesting, granular look at how this process works. But essentially, the opinion piece is put up by him the day after. Again, it's just singing from the same hymn sheet. A couple of days later, the opinion piece is republished in China News as an organic op-ed, untainted by any kind of Chinese influence at the start of the process. And just more examples of how it works, and also just to point to the kind of efficiency of being able to co-opt a media group into your influence operation is that you reach multiple titles within that group as well. A couple more examples of the type of laundering that goes on at independent and the independent media titles. For example, they'll take a story by a Chinese journalist, in this case Liam Lee from the Takung Bao newspaper, and republish it under another name, which is a more Western name, to try and give it the impression that it's a kind of again an organic piece of content produced by that South African newspaper. It's worth pointing at the kind of complexity of the reach that they gain with the Independent Media Group. Independent Media Group owns the African News Agency, which distributes content across the continent. I think it distributes to 40 media houses across the continent. Not only does it distribute the laundered content, and also its own, of course, it also distributes its own kind of, content that is unrelated to any influence operations, unless you count the Premier League football as, an influence operation, which you probably should. They also distribute the Xinhua news agency feed as well. So, it's not only is the relationship China/Xinhua to news operation. There's also African News Agency disseminating, which is a whole different kind of order of trust and authority, I suppose. Another thing they do is they mysteriously publish everything that the Chinese embassy in South Africa puts out. Here's one about how the genocide tag against China is the lie of the century. This, again, is an opinion piece by the Chinese ambassador, which then gets repurposed for other opinion pieces within the independent media stable. I actually don't have the slide for this, but we also had an analysis of how often the Chinese embassy gets quoted in the South African media, and it was basically only on this independent media platform. Right, so that is a quick run through of the kind of highlights of how of the kind of pillars of influence that China is able to wield or manipulate within African media ecosystems. Again, this was purely for Zambia, Kenya, and South Africa, but we have found that these patterns play out across the continent, and the next talk that Code for Africa is giving at Hoppers 2 will delve much more deeply into that. So thank you very much. We obviously we don't want to leave you with just the kind of overwhelming impression that it's nothing to be done. And I think somebody asked earlier about how do we address the issue of this Chinese support in all various ways, from infrastructure support, from resource support, from training, sending people on junkets. How do we address that? We have some suggested synergies, again, which we're probably going to go into a bit more detail in our next talk. But first of all, I think is that we need, and I think Emmanuel referred to this, we need to resource and empower African media houses to inoculate themselves against this. It's not just going to be around supplying resources or training. It's also going to be about supplying the kind of data and research and analysis that's needed to understand this as a problem. One of the slightly frightening things I think we found in our research was that many of the journalists we spoke to did not see this as a problem and had actually not surfaced on their radar as something they needed to watch out for in their day-to-day jobs as journalists. They did not see foreign government influence, not just China, but foreign government influence as something that dramatically affected their day-to-day jobs, which I think the research shows that, in fact, it does do that. Just to leave you with one other thought, which is that the platform that we use to monitor African media, which Amanda manages, called Civic Media Cloud, is available to anybody who wishes to partner with us and who has suggestions for research topics that fall within the ambit of this. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much for the presentation. You talked about the laundering cycle and going from Chinese to an African voice, then back to Chinese, which, candidly, from my view, the second piece of that, the Chinese voice being re-amplified, I think the audience for a lot of that is probably going to be domestically or something along those lines, so it probably doesn't have as much impact on the continent itself. But could you talk about, do you have cases where that African voice that is writing an op-ed that's on the Xinhua piece, that becomes content for yet another African voice to, and in that way laundering in that direction within the continent itself to give extra legitimacy? Have there been any examples of that?
Yeah, there are a couple of answers to that. The first one is that because of the mechanism of the African News Agency, the content coming back in then gets laundered onto other African countries and titles as part of a content feed. So it's not just domestic audience. The bit about whether that narrative is picked up by other news houses, absolutely. There's many examples of the kind of I mean, I'm running out of terminology for these different kinds of articles here now, but the article that's been bounced back from China, or the laundered Chinese article in an independent newspaper publication, for example, gets picked up as a research point for other journalists writing about the same things. And even worse than that, well, not even worse, but also bad, is that, for example, populist parties within South Africa will pick up the narrative being pushed by independent, and then, like, take, for example, the pro-Sinovac narrative. They will use that to do kind of anti-Western, anti-ruling party protests in the real physical world, which then gets picked up by media houses as, look, here's a political party that believes that we are being screwed over by the West, and China's got the best vaccine. All gets traced back to the start of that rinse cycle, as Amanda calls it. So yeah, there are many examples of that.
Does that work? Yeah. So one of your piece at the end says essentially kind of identify proxies or people contributing and building up Chinese influence operations in South Africa. Have you felt the Chinese actually pushing back and suing people who actually are like essentially building this? I know in Europe and North America, the Chinese are starting to sue professors and journalists and activists who are building that. Not yet in South Africa?
Well, funny you should ask that. I'm actually going to be starting my crowdfund for my defense tomorrow. So this isn't a direct example, but I'm being sued by the owner of independent media, me and like about 100 other 50 other different journalists and media houses for different things. And the supposition is that, and all the kind of media, the kind of legal attacks happen after some Chinese, anti-Chinese investigation by one of the media houses. And then mysteriously, the man who owns independent media is suing us. And obviously, it's kind of a slap lawsuit attempting to stop you from being able to do your work. So I don't know if that precisely answers your question, but I just felt to bring the personal anecdote in might be funny. So yeah, that is that. I see my colleague has a question, which is always worrying. Oh, God. Framing them, including my colleague Chris as the CIA agent. Interestingly published into US media. So any watchdogs who are funded by US government agencies are not allowed to investigate or rebut it. Because there's a congressional law that says if you're funded by the US, you're not allowed to kind of mention or go after US citizens. So they figured out that as a shield. And then that then again goes through this rinse cycle of repeated kind of laundering until it becomes established fact. Yeah, I mean, highly paid as well. I mean, if anybody here teaches journalism and you want examples of like how not to do an investigation, it's to go and Google investigations into myself and other people about how, I mean, their evidence for me being a CIA agent is like, I once visited Washington. So it's the most important thing. And the impact is not just kind of along geopolitical lines. The impact is also like a very profoundly anti-democratic impact, because media in South Africa becomes problematized, and of course you've all gone through this in your own countries, where trust, evaporates and it becomes like there is no truth and this kind of thing. So it's actually has some profound effects that are not just, you don't want to just take it back to Beijing. You can actually take it back to several centers of anti-democratic power in the world.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for an amazing talk. So I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on sort of social network labeling of content as coming from government-affiliated organisations, because I guess the old way is to say, well, look, this page is operated directly by X organisation, but what you've shown is that it's way more nuanced than that. Have you got any thoughts on what needs to be done to improve that labelling moving forward?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I don't really know that I do. I don't have a lot of faith in the labeling something that's like this is a government-sponsored organization, as it is. I mean, I don't want to go down the route of my insane ex-countryman Elon Musk, but I think the more kind of we attempt to apply barriers to access to information, the easier it is going to be actually for agents of misinformation to hive off into their own corner of doing that. So I actually not answering your question very well, but I guess my ultimate answer would be that I think it's slightly futile, but probably has to be done. I don't know if you have a different view. There's one in the back there. Oh.
Thanks very much for this. So at Freedom House, we did a report of a case study of CCP media influence in a number of countries. And South Africa was one of the case studies, and I'd be curious if your findings, like how this works, because the IOL case was very clear, right? But I think one of the things that our local analysts kind of pushed back against or raised was where that fits in the broader media ecosystem, that it has an audience, it is one of the most popular, like if you look, it's like, especially, it is kind of unique in terms of other countries, especially with the investment and the stakes. But that if you look overall, there was a lot of critical coverage. We did find some examples of them also running like news wires, say, like there was some reporting on Xinjiang and things like that. So they were pushing propaganda, but there was also some diversity of coverage, I guess, in terms of critical. So I was just kind of curious, because you mentioned something also about, I guess like some of the, like within their ecosystem and the outlets they control, clearly there's significant influence, but how that fits in terms of the broader South African media ecosystem. And then I was curious, related to that, this difference between, let's say, coverage of, say, human rights abuses in China, as opposed to like the China-Africa relations dimension, and the way in which the CCP tries to manipulate the narrative there. So those were the two questions I had. I don't know if that's clear.
So if the first question is about whether the impact is as permeates the media ecosystem.
Beyond the IOL,
yeah.
Like, because especially if you're looking at, say, broadcast media, South African Broadcasting Company, that's pretty influential, I think, to be trusted. Other, like, newspapers that have good, like, investigative reporting on what's happening. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, Justin, sorry, do you want to contribute to that?
Just very quickly, because before you jump in, I think a lot of that research doesn't really delve down into the revolving door between media themselves. There's a high churn rate. And so independent media is one of the largest employers of journalists in South Africa. In addition to that, it's got an audience of like 33 million people out of a country of 60 or 55 million, a population of 55. So it's a significant player. It publishes over 40 titles, which are invariably the lead title in each of their geographic markets in the English language media. And in addition to that, it commands a sizable amount of government and other advertising in the country. So it owns a big stake. And the corrosive effect there is not just on the content of the journalism. They've resigned from the self-regulated press ombuds system. Yes. They've disaffiliated from the Industry Publisher Association. Yeah. Chris, I don't know if they're involved in the editor forum. They've also resigned from that. Yeah. And they prevent any of their editors from getting involved, or staff from getting involved in those organizations. But then also they have this attack editorial policy where they have imaginary, non-existent investigative units of like literally invented journalists with invented bylines who go after anyone else in the other media who's slightly critical of either their line or a mainline land, kind of China or Russia. Yeah. They're also big pushers of Russian narratives. Yeah. So I think that's a corrosive, their titles are so kind of widespread that it starts lowering the benchmark for everyone else. So. Chris, I don't know, you've probably got way more. I don't live in South Africa, by the way. He does, so he might have more in...
I mean, so I think Chris's example earlier about it becoming a political football becomes quite important, because within even our governing party, there are two factions that then use that narrative as a reason why the other faction is captured by sort of the US or by Russia, or by kind of insert any foreign power. So it might not become it might not be as impactful necessarily, but it becomes a kind of talking point, which in turn becomes a talking point for people who support specific factions within within politics. So it has that sort of, again, cycle system, and then that's used as the source of truth. So it's deciding who is the source of truth, while the independent group. So every other news that they publish is then believed because, look, this person is a CIA agent, so therefore we run with that. So that's the sort of almost soft power that turns into a much more impactful power.
Yeah, I would also say that there's a difference between asking somebody within the media about the impact of China on media narratives and asking somebody who just reads the news. I think you get very different answers from both of them. Thank you very much, everybody. There's a sign being waved at me, so our time is up. Thank you so much.